meditation on the Larger Catechism considers question number 93, which reads as follows: What is the moral law? The answer is that the moral law is the declaration of the will of God to mankind, directing and binding everyone to personal, perfect, and perpetual conformity and obedience thereunto, in the frame and disposition of the whole man, soul and body, and in performance of all those duties of holiness and righteousness which he oweth to God and man, promising life upon the fulfilling, and threatening death upon the breach of it. There is a moral law, a revelation from God that enters into our hearts, our natures, our conscience, which reminds us that we have a duty or an obligation before our Creator to live for and serve Him. It is a law because it has its source in God. God alone can speak with such authority that He binds our response in obedience. We cannot just simply impress upon others our own feelings or thoughts as to what is moral or right or good. It must be founded upon God's revelation of Himself. And God has done that. The words of the Catechism are directing and binding everyone to personal, perfect, and perpetual conformity, and so forth. Directing, that is leading, guiding, instructing us in the ways of righteousness, binding us to those ways, enforcing them upon us such that we live in accord with them. And the obedience that we ought to give to that law is personal, that is from the heart, reflecting one's mind, soul, will, and emotions. Personal obedience is the perfect, that is complete, nothing lacking, not just a start of obedience but failing to bring it to completion. Perfect obedience and perpetual. Not simply at the start of life, not at important moments in time, but throughout the whole course of life, every moment of life, we are subject to God's law and owe Him personal, perfect, and perpetual conformity and obedience to God's law. We do so in the frame and disposition of the whole man, soul and body. So there have been many efforts on the part of some to restrict God's law, mostly to binding our outward behaviors. And so most people have the idea that they are basically good before God because they have not committed the outward acts, breaches of God's law, the extremes of disobedience. But as we learn from the Gospels, Jesus in particular in His Sermon on the Mount emphasizes that God's law does not only consider our outward behaviors, but also our inward thought life, our feelings, our passions, our desires. All needs to be brought into conformity with God's law. We are not simply to restrain ourselves from bad behaviors. While that is good, that's not sufficient. There also must be positively the obedience, the outworking of the moral law in life, whereby we perform those duties of holiness and righteousness that we owe to God and man. And so, when the Ten Commandments tell us not to worship God through idols, it's not sufficient simply to not have visual pictures of God before you. You should worship Him in spirit, positively, worshiping Him in accord with His Word. So, positive duty is enforced as well in God's moral law. The obedience of God's law is not simply a rote matter. God does reward obedience. He promises life upon the fulfilling and threatens death upon the breach of it. Who can obey this law? Who can keep it perfectly or adequately? We all fall far short of God's moral standards. And so that is why it is necessary for us to have a Redeemer, a Savior, who can deliver us. Think of the righteousness of Jesus Christ. He is the one who has kept this law perfectly. Not only in outward behaviors, but also in his heart, his mind, his soul. He delighted in the law of God. He delighted in the will of God. He obeyed his Father perfectly and completely. even to the very end when he went to the cross to die for us, he was still obeying his Father perfectly. Such is the obedience of Jesus, and it's only that righteousness that we rest upon for righteousness before God. We can never keep this law perfectly ourselves.